if you look at the literature, I think many papers have shown adverse effects of such policies, in particular, let's say, first-generation rent control policies, which really stipulate caps on rents, including papers by Konstantin and Sophie, which are cited here. So two effects that have been often shown are a reduction in the quality and quantity of housing, for example, because of neglect of required maintenance, or because landlords sell their houses or apartments to owner-occupiers, and also misallocation and overconsumption of housing. Nevertheless, rent control policies are very popular in the population. So I think it's a very good example of a policy that seems to be opposed by experts but embraced by the public. And that's what we want to study in our paper. So we asked kind of two research questions. We try to address which aspects matter for support for rent control, and can correcting misinformation affect support, and then which respondents react to the provided information and why. So what we have done in the paper is we have run a large-scale survey experiment in Germany on agreement with a restrictive form of rent control, the Berlin rent cap. Let me briefly talk about the Berlin rent cap. That was kind of a first-generation rent control policy stipulating rents, caps on the rents. It was introduced it was announced in June 2019, introduced in February 2020, and then declared unconstitutional by the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany in April 21 on formal grounds, because there was already kind of a regulation implemented by the federal level, and then the Federal Constitutional Court decided that the state of Berlin is not allowed to implement an additional layer of regulation. Our survey was fielded in May, so shortly after the rent cap was declared unconstitutional. We have a representative sample of the German population of 18,000 respondents, representative with respect to age, gender, and occupational status, and oversampling urban areas. We deliberately did that. And we randomly assign respondents into 6 groups in total, 1 control group, 5 treatment groups, and we confront respondents in the treatment groups with information treatments about the effects of rent control and the Berlin rental housing market, in order to understand which aspects really matter for people in their assessment of rent control policies. So that's kind of the structure of the questionnaire. It starts with a neutral explainer of the Berlin rent cap that is shown to everyone, also to respondents in the control group. Then respondents are randomized or randomly assigned into one of these 6 groups. We elicit prior beliefs on the respective aspect, but only in the respective treatment group. Then there is this information treatment in the respective treatment group. And then our main outcome question reads, what is your general assessment of rent control policies like the Berlin rent cap? This is elicited on an 11-point Likert scale, ranging from 0 to 10. And then at the end, we elicit the remaining beliefs, so posterior beliefs in the respective treatment groups and prior beliefs in the other groups, including the control group. So that will be important, as I will discuss later. So prior beliefs in the control group are only elicited at the end, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And then we have also some post-experimental questions on the credibility, perceived credibility of the information treatments and the perceived political bias of our survey. Okay, so let me start with kind of who actually supports the rent cap in the German population, and this is shown here, average support by subgroups in the control group. So this is really support in the control group, which is not affected by any information treatments. And interestingly, you see that kind of across all groups, average support is relatively high. I mentioned this outcome question ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest level of support. The mean is 6.2 and the median is 7. So more than 60% of respondents in the control group rate this policy as positively. And if you look at the subgroups, it's interesting, I think, to see that even owner-occupiers or landlords who would have a self-interest, economic self-interest, which speaks against such a policy, they do not really reject this policy. So even if you look at the landlords, for example, their average support is above 5.5. So it's really interesting to see that even these groups do not reject such a policy. We also show this by voting. So we asked respondents for which political party they voted in the last federal election. If you look, for example, at the FDP voters, so this is the liberal business-friendly party, even those voters don't reject such a harsh market intervention. Okay, now let me walk you through the treatments in our paper and the treatment effects. So now, first, let's briefly talk about kind of how our treatments might affect respondents. So we think, the treatments in general affect our respondents via two channels. The first is the priming channel, by making respondents think about a certain aspect and put the front and center in their mind. And here it's important to come back to the fact that we elicit prior beliefs in the control group only after the outcome question. So if we had elicited prior beliefs in the control group before the outcome question, we would have missed this priming channel, right? Because then we would have primed respondents in the control group as well. And we deliberately did not do that because we think that might be an important channel. And it turns out that's true, it is an important channel. And then the second channel is the information provision channel. So by informing respondents about a certain aspect and potentially by correcting their misperceptions if they have any, right? Clearly we cannot separate these two effects, formally. But you will see when I present the results that this priming channel plays an important role. And then these are the 5 treatment groups. Let me first talk about the first and the fifth treatment groups, so that the efficiency treatment and the displacement treatment. You will see that these are the 2 treatments that shift average support, where we find significant average treatment effects. The other 3 treatments do not shift average support. So in the efficiency treatment group, or for respondents in the efficiency treatment group, we asked 2 questions, namely what they think is the effect of the rent cap on the supply of rental housing and rents in the unregulated segment. 2 prior belief questions. And then the information treatment informs respondents that previous research has shown that rent control policies like the Berlin rent cap reduce the supply of rental housing and also lead to higher rents in the unregulated segment. So this treatment clearly emphasizes negative efficiency effects of the Berlin rent cap. And then we also tell respondents that initial study results indicate that the Berlin rent cap indeed has led to similar effects. Here, clearly, the expected treatment effect is to lower support for the Berlin rent cap. And then in the displacement treatment, we ask respondents whether they think that rent control policies like the Berlin rent cap can protect lower income households from being forced out of the city. And then we inform them that studies have shown that indeed rent regulations like the Berlin rent cap can protect lower income households from displacements. So if you think about, for example, one famous AER paper by Rebecca Diamond from 2018, I think that's one of her main findings, that lower income households, so she studies a rent expansion policy in San Francisco, and she shows that lower income households have a higher likelihood to stay in the city. So that's kind of, if you want, one positive effect of rent control policies. And here the expected treatment effect is really to increase support for the rent cap. And then very briefly, our other treatments. So we really thought about kind of providing different treatments to elicit which factors might affect support for the rent cap. And one hypothesis we had was that distributional concerns might matter. So in the distribution treatment, we inform respondents that landlords on average have higher incomes than tenants. And so our hypothesis was that respondents might favor rent control policies out of a demand for a redistribution, for example. Then the third treatment group informed respondents about an aspect specific to the Berlin market. So there we informed respondents that private sector companies indeed constitute the largest group of landlords in the Berlin housing market. I think they, at that time, 2019, I think is our source, so 29% of all rental apartments are from private sector companies. And I think that was our reading. One motivation for the rent cap was out of a negative sentiment towards private investors. So that's why we included this treatment. And then the fourth one is our affordable housing treatment, where we inform respondents about the share of income spent on housing, and that this share actually has remained relatively stable in recent decades. I think we look at the period from 2006 to 2018, and this share has remained relatively stable, which might be surprising at first glance, given that rents have been rising, but incomes have been rising as well. And so the motivation for this treatment was really that the rent cap might be favored, or rent regulation, out of a concern concerning the affordability of housing. Okay, and here you can see average treatment effects. You see that on this 11-point Likert scale, the efficiency treatment reduces support for the Berlin rent cap by roughly 1 point or percentage point, and the displacement treatment increases support by roughly 0.5, whereas the other three treatments do not shift support for the rent cap on average. And then in the paper, we study heterogeneity of our treatment effects with respect to misperceptions. And in particular, we ask whether treatment effects are larger for those people who have misperceptions about the aspect that they are informed about in the information treatment. So basically, we study the role of this information provision and how this compares to the priming effect. Okay, let me focus here on the two treatments that shift average support for the rent control policies, like the Berlin rent cap, the efficiency treatment. What you see here is, so first interesting result is, I think, those respondents who have, so this is without controls, so those respondents in the control group who have misperceptions about the efficiency effects, they have on average higher support for rent control policies. So respondents who are not aware of negative efficiency effects or who don't believe in negative efficiency effects, they have a higher support for rent control policies. Then if you look at the first row, respondents who have no misperceptions with respect to efficiency effects, they have, for those respondents, we reduce their support for the rent cap. So they are already aware of these efficiency effects. And priming this reduces their support. But then, interestingly, if we interact the misperceptions, which are coded from 0 to 5, so remember, we had 2 prior belief questions, which could be answered completely wrong, slightly wrong, or correctly. So we have these 5 misperception categories. Interacting these misperceptions with the treatment dummy, this interaction diminishes, so the treatment effect becomes smaller the more severe the misperceptions are. And this is confirmed in our split sample regressions, where we estimate average treatment effect for all 6 groups. So splitting up people in the treatment group by the degree of misperception. So we find strongest treatment effects for respondents who don't have any misperceptions on efficiency effects or only small misperceptions. And this treatment effect diminishes the more severe or the stronger the misperceptions become. And then we find very similar patterns for the displacement treatment. Again, respondents who have misperceptions, so who don't believe that rent control policies can protect low-income households from displacement, in the control group, they have a lower support for the Berlin rent cap. We increase support for the rent cap for respondents who don't have misperceptions with regard to the displacement or protection against displacement. But there is basically a null effect of our treatment for respondents who have misperceptions. And this again is confirmed in the split sample regressions, So a positive effect of the treatment on support for the rent cap for respondents without misperceptions, and a null effect for those with misperceptions. So here the misperception is simply yes or no, right? Because this was one prior belief question which could be answered either correctly or wrongly. Okay, to sum up what I've shown so far, so the efficiency and the displacement treatments, they shift average support for the rent cap, but the effect tends to diminish or to decrease in misperceptions, and our treatments seem to work via the priming channel, not the information provision channel. And we affect mostly those who are already or almost correct about the respective aspect, and since prior beliefs are correlated with support for the rent cap, this implies that we affect mostly those who are already more in favor or against the rent cap. So let me skip this for the sake of time and directly jump to this table. So then we try to investigate mechanisms why this might be the case. And here we make use of our post-experimental questions. So I mentioned we asked respondents at the end of the survey how credible they found our information treatments, whether they found the survey as, or perceived the survey as ideologically biased, and also we elicited their own political orientation, in particular asking them for which party they voted in the last federal election. And then we correlate kind of these variables with misperceptions. And what you see here, or what these regressions or correlations basically show is, maybe not surprising, respondents who have misperceptions, and this holds basically for 4 out of 5 treatments, they find the provided information, or they assess the provided information as less credible. Then, looking at the second row, how ideologically biased they found our survey, and this ideologically biased variable is coded from, I think, from 0 to 4, with higher values indicating let me put it right. So those who perceive the survey as, let's say, left-wing, they have lower those who, other way around. So those who say that our survey is perceived, or who consider our survey as right-leaning, are more likely to have misperceptions with regard to the efficiency treatment, and those who and they are less likely to have misperceptions in the displacement treatment. And with regard to own political orientation, respondents who are left-leaning are more likely to have misperceptions in the efficiency treatment, and less likely to have misperceptions in the displacement treatment. So these results basically suggest that information that goes against politically motivated priors is discounted as politically biased and thus less credible. Okay, and then finally, we run a follow-up survey 1 year later, where we included a composite treatment combining the efficiency and the displacement treatment, because we wanted to explore how respondents react if they are confronted with kind of both aspects. And indeed, this combined treatment reduces support for the rent cap, but less so than one could have expected when adding up the separate treatment effects of the efficiency and the displacement treatment. And importantly, we also included an incentivized outcome question. So we informed respondents that after the survey is run, 50 or 20 respondents would be selected, and that these respondents would earn an extra remuneration of 50 euros. And then we asked them, if they are selected, they would have the option to donate this money, the 50 euros, all of the 50 euros or part of it, to an organization lobbying for extensive rent control in Germany, Kampagne Mietenstopp. And then we asked them to basically allocate how much they would donate, and we find that the displacement treatment increases donations to this lobby organization, right? So average donations in the control group are 16 euros out of the 50 euros, And the displacement treatment increases donations by almost €2, so there is a significant treatment effect also on our incentivized outcome question. We interpret this as a validation of our main outcome question, and also, I mean, this clearly indicates that our treatments do not only shift stated preferences, but also revealed preferences. And that's why we think this is important to have such an incentivized outcome question as well. Okay, let me conclude. Our paper shows that pointing out efficiency costs lower support, and pointing out that it can prevent displacement increases support. We do not find any evidence that demand for redistribution, negative sentiments towards institutional investors, or concerns about affordability play a major role. At least we don't find evidence for that. And then we show that our treatments shift average support, but the effect tends to decrease with misperceptions. So ideology, confirmation bias seem to matter in our setting. Yeah. One topic or one aspect we discuss a bit in the paper is how to design information treatments, given that our results suggest that for such a policy it's really hard to convince people with misperceptions. One side finding we have in the paper is that given that our efficiency treatment contained 2 prior belief questions, and it's interesting that we seem to shift support for those with slight misperceptions, even stronger than for those who have no misperceptions at all. I think these information campaigns are important. Just think about COVID or climate change, these things. And one side result of our paper is that at least the efficiency treatment was effective in shifting support of those who have small misperceptions. So confirming respondents or their priors in one aspect and then correcting their priors in another aspect seemed to work in our case. That's it. Thanks for your attention and happy to hear your comments.
Thank you very much. And congratulations for the nice piece of research. My question is very simple. I am a lawyer. I have a simple mind. So my concern is about T5, is about distribution. And you pointed out that this was a positive thing to support rent control because it allows less affluent people to stay. This is the perception. Did you tell them the full truth, which is basically that if you implement this, you don't allow more or less affluent people to come into the city never again? Did you tell them this or not?
No, that's a good question. You're absolutely right. I mean, of course, there are negative side effects that people who benefit from living in a rent-controlled apartment might stay longer there, and it might be harder for incomers. We deliberately we didn't tell the full story. So each of the 5 groups were only confronted with one aspect, kind of efficiency or displacement. So only in this follow-up we combined the 2 treatments, which had kind of significant average treatment effects in the first survey. The reason we didn't tell the full story to all respondents is that we really, the aim of the paper was really to investigate which aspects matter, and we cannot separate this if we kind of tell the full story to everyone. Right? So that's why each treatment group was confronted with a certain aspect, but not with the full story.
For the others, okay. Thanks again. That's very interesting. I have a couple of questions just to understand it also. First, the survey was for entire Germany, right? You did not specifically interview people from Berlin.
So shall I ask directly? Or shall I answer directly?
Yeah, well, that's the first one.
So the survey was run in Germany, and yes, we had many respondents also from Berlin. And we also, in a robustness check, we also look at kind of effects, how Berlin compares to the rest of Germany. In general, one picture is that treatment effects seem to be a bit larger in larger cities like Berlin, but in general, the general pattern is the same.
So people in Berlin are not different to people in Munich, or
No.
people, because I would have kind of expected people that know it, that they may, but anyhow, if they're not, okay, good.
So so that's an important question. So I haven't mentioned that in my talk. We run a lot of heterogeneity analysis. So kind of how do treatment effects differ? I mean, clearly I've shown at the very beginning that average support in the control group differs across groups, right? Kind of younger people might have different views than older people and so on. But we investigate kind of how treatment effects differ, so treatment heterogeneity across groups. And there the interesting finding is that treatment effects are uniform across the population. So there we do not find much heterogeneity in terms of, so landlords do not react differently to our treatments than tenants, or people in Berlin do not react differently to our treatments or in the larger cities than those living in rural areas. So treatment effects seem to be rather uniform across the population. I mean,
that's the main purpose of the experiments, but I was also wondering whether the a priori beliefs are totally different, right?
The prior beliefs.
Right, exactly. Because I mean, I would expect that must be in some way different, right?
Yeah, we also look at how misperceptions differ across the population. There are some differences, but that's not kind of that something really pops up, that kind of there is one specific group which is completely uninformed about a certain aspect. So think about that. This Berlin rent cap, I think, was a very salient policy. So there was a lot of media coverage, a lot of discussion. So I think it's not the case. Maybe people in Berlin were kind of, I guess they knew more about the specific regulations of this rent control policy, but I think this general idea of capping rents and how this was implemented in Berlin, I think this was well understood in the population. Mm-hmm. And I mean, our prior belief questions, we don't ask people, do you really know the details of this rent regulation? But our treatments are more about kind of general aspects and consequences of rent control policies. And there, we don't see big differences, kind of how people think about these things, or to what extent they have misperceptions across people in Berlin versus the rest.
And then the other question was also because you have done like which party they are voting for as kind of to understand whether they are more left or right or whatever. Do you have any other heterogeneity when it comes to beliefs and support for certain policies or something like that? Or was that the only question to understand whether their belief sets are fundamentally different? Because I think there's more than which party I vote for. There's still a lot of other things that may influence whether I'm more supporting for the state or not. You may still be a young person voting for a certain party, but having still very different beliefs in what the public should do, right? Absolutely. It's not always matching, right?
Absolutely, yes. We have, for example, we have questions on the role of the government, kind of redistributive preferences. We also have a variable on economic news consumption, whether people and how often they consume economic news and these things. There is no treatment heterogeneity with regard to these aspects. And also there is no treatment heterogeneity with regard to political orientation. So this treatment heterogeneity, that is also important. So thanks for the question. That's really excellent. So the treatment heterogeneity with regard to misperceptions really survives if we include in the specification other heterogeneity. So if we also control for political orientation and interact the treatment dummy with political orientation, the significant treatment heterogeneity with respect to misperceptions survives. It really remains. So it's really kind of the heterogeneity seems to really come from having misperceptions and not so much other things. Mm-hmm. So that's really kind of, and this is really robust.
So it's education at the end? Or economic education
yes,
in some way?
To some extent it's education. So I don't have it on the slides, but we are including such a table in our revised version of the paper where we kind of correlate the misperceptions with other socio-demographic variables we elicit in the survey. And yes, so having, let's say, a university degree means that you are less likely to have misperceptions. That's right, yeah.
Is there any chance that you can compare the results with historical results? I mean, are people today more well educated, or are they more likely today to follow these, let us say, populist measures of rent control? I mean, historically, people were more tangible and practical, or this is.
So I mean, kind of, our main question then really is kind of their political orientation. So we don't know, I mean, we don't elicit kind of to what extent they believe in populist attitudes in general, or these things that we do not know. I mean, we elicit political orientation by their voting patterns in the last election, and then these other questions I just mentioned, like redistributive preferences, economic news consumptions, but we don't know more kind of to what extent they believe in populist views. Once more presentation. Yeah, thanks a lot. So let me, while the slides are setting up, so thanks for all your comments and suggestions. So this second presentation is kind of really work in progress. So we started this project actually a few years ago, and then there was this excellent paper published by Sophie and Konstantin and co-authors in management science. And actually a few weeks ago we restarted this project and did run some regressions to look at kind of to check whether there are some long-term effects of the Berlin rent cap. So the second paper is not a survey experiment. It's again about the Berlin rent cap, but not a survey experiment really, but looking at the effects of the Berlin rent cap. And looking at these more longer-term effects of the Berlin rent cap, we think we find some interesting results, and we are really interested in hearing your views on that. So it's really preliminary work and work in progress, so any comments and suggestions you might have, in particular on the second paper now, or project now, are very welcome. I guess this presentation will be a bit shorter. So how, in terms of timing, we have to, it's a PowerPoint presentation. So this is the PowerPoint presentation. You have it right. Okay. So yeah, this is joint work with Clemens, David, Carla, and Florian, all from IFO. Okay, I already talked about the Berlin rent cap in my previous presentation, so I guess I can be brief about this. So this was kind of, as I mentioned before, a kind of first generation rent control policy, putting caps on rents, not limiting the growth in rents, but caps on rents, or freeze on rents. The rent cap was introduced depending on the residential location, so I think there was a differentiation between good, medium, or poor neighborhoods, the year of construction and furnishing. The capping of rents was substantially below market levels. There was one group which was exempt, namely, that's I guess the main group that was exempt, were newly built apartments that became ready for first-time occupancy in 2014 or later. The policy was introduced for a 5-year period. I think the idea was then to check after the 5 years how things have evolved in Berlin. But then it was introduced in February 2020, and I mentioned before in April 21, it was declared unconstitutional on formal grounds. And interestingly then, in September of the same year, so September 21, there was a referendum in Berlin on a citizens' initiative with the goal to expropriate private real estate companies with 3,000 or more units in the city. The referendum passed, but results were non-binding and no expropriation has taken place until today. I learned before this presentation that actually there seem to be some plans to do so, and I read that there are plans for a second referendum, which would then be legally binding. So, and what we want to investigate is kind of the more long-term effects of this rent cap and the referendum on the Berlin housing market. So short-term effects have been well documented and studied in the paper by Sophie and Konstantin and co-authors. And what we are looking at are more kind of the long-term effects. Very briefly, what are we doing? So we are using data from an online housing portal, Immobilien Scout 24, which is the largest one in Germany. Right now, we look at data from January 2018 until summer 23. Clearly, we want to expand that, but that's the data we currently have at hand. The data typically for these online ads, I mean, we have all the information that is kind of posted in these online ads, kind of the date of the ad, the rent or the sales price. So these are asking prices. That's important to emphasize, not transaction prices. The postcode and property characteristics like construction year, floor space, number of rooms, and these things, everything that is posted. And then we employ a simple difference approach where we compare housing market trends in Berlin with those in other major cities with more than 500,000 inhabitants before and after the introduction of the Berlin rent cap. We differentiate between the regulated and the unregulated segment. You will see that patterns really differ between these segments. I mean, now we must say the formally regulated segment because the rent cap has been abolished. And you see we have roughly 1,365,000 rental ads and 765,000 sales ads in our data. And let me directly jump into the results. So what we see, and here we look at the price-rent ratio. The first dashed line, that's kind of that's June 2019, where the rent cap was announced. Then the second dashed line was February 2020, when it was introduced. And the third dashed line here is April 21, when it was abolished. And then, I mean, the following graphs I will present look very similar to this one, I mean, in terms of kind of showing these different results. And we don't have dashed lines here, but it might make sense to include this as well. A few months later, there was this Berlin referendum, which might also kind of affect our results. And you can see here, when we look at this price-rent ratio, we will disaggregate this later on, you see that Berlin, the price-rent ratio has grown more in Berlin compared to the control group, and everything is assessed relative to the second quarter of 2019 when the Berlin rent cap was announced, has grown faster first, but then it went down, right? And this seems to persist also until more recent periods. So now breaking this down to rents, so here we compare rents in the regulated segment and in the unregulated segment. So this has been well documented in the paper by Sophie and Konstantin et al. I mean, by law, of course, rents had to be reduced in the regulated segment in Berlin. And you see that here after the abolishment, growth rates kind of recovered, and now growth rates in rents in the formally regulated segment in Berlin are more or less the same as in the control group. Interestingly, things look a bit different in the unregulated segment. So already in the period when the rent cap was in place, growth rates in rents in the unregulated segment were higher in Berlin compared to the control group. And one interpretation of this finding is that there was excess demand in the regulated segment that could not be satisfied there, and that led to higher prices or higher rents in the unregulated segment. So spillover effects, if you want, of the Berlin rent cap. And interestingly, while, I mean, there were more or less no pre-trends before the announcement of the Berlin rent cap, this price increase kind of increase or went on. So growth rates in rents in the formerly unregulated segment in Berlin are higher compared to the control group. Now looking at sales prices. In the regulated segment, I mean, that is probably what one could have expected. That, I mean, given that rents decrease, also sales prices decrease in the regulated segment. What we find interesting, and this, I guess, explains also part of the patterns in the price-rent ratio, that this has not really recovered, right? So given that the Berlin rent cap was abolished, I mean, one hypothesis would have been that also sales prices recover, in particular given the fact that rents, both in the formally regulated segment and also in the unregulated segment, have been increasing in Berlin a lot compared to the control group. But this seems to be not the case for sales prices, and that's kind of one, we think, interesting pattern that is relevant to explore. Things are a bit different in the unregulated segment. And now we kind of, unfortunately only since 2019, but I think we think that's also interesting, we have information on who is kind of providing these ads. And here we can differentiate between private people, so private offerers, real estate agents, and the housing industry, so private sector companies like Deutsche Wohnen and Vonovia, the big players. If you look at the development or the evolution of rents in the formally regulated segment, it's interesting to see that the private sector companies, the growth in rents in their ads is substantially and significantly lower, both compared to the control group, but also compared to other suppliers of rental ads in Berlin. So one interpretation here is, and here we think that might be an effect of the referendum, which caused a lot of policy uncertainty for these companies who have a threat of expropriation, that they seem to kind of reduce rents or be more careful in raising rents compared to other suppliers in Berlin. If you look at sales prices in the formally regulated segment, also sales prices are of the housing industry are lower than in the control group and also lower compared to private offerers. Okay, now focusing on supply and demand. Here you can see the number of rental and sales ads in the formally regulated segment. Again, this has been documented well in the paper by Sophie and Konstantin and co-authors. There was a strong reduction in the supply of rental ads when the Berlin rent cap was in place. So there might be two different effects. So one would be lock-in effects. Tenants who benefit from living in a regulated apartment don't move out, because you have seen that rents in the unregulated segment went up a lot. So you really benefit from living in such a regulated apartment. So this reduces the number of rental ads. Another potential effect might be that landlords rather sell their apartments instead of renting out them again. And if you look at the evolution of sales ads in the formally regulated segment, this second channel seems to play an important role. So sales ads in the regulated segment went up more than in the control group. So this is kind of, if you see that this reduction of rental ads when the Berlin rent cap was in place, but this increase in the number of sales ads when the Berlin rent cap was in place. Okay, and then here again, we think interesting, this is now again split up for the different suppliers, private offerers, real estate agents, and the housing industry. And I want to emphasize this finding here. These are sales ads, the number of sales ads in the formally regulated segment. It seems that private sector companies now put more apartments on the market. So you see that kind of the evolution of the number of sales ads of these private sector companies, there are higher growth rates. So this suggests that they seem to reduce their stock of housing in Berlin compared to other offers in the market. And then finally, of course, I mean, we don't have any transaction data right now at hand. So in order to look at the demand side of the markets, we look at the number of hits for a rental ad. And this is an interesting pattern that the rental ads in the regulated segment, there was a lot of demand. This went up when the Berlin rent cap was in place, and much less interest in buying an apartment that is regulated. So this is also, we think, an interesting finding that a lot of demand to rent such an apartment, but much less demand to buy an apartment that is regulated. Okay, so that's all what we have right now. Our results that I've shown you suggest that longer-term effects of the Berlin rent cap are in place, and that the referendum, and also the referendum on the housing market in Berlin seems to matter. Interestingly, there are different patterns in ads from the housing industry compared to the rest of the market. So lower growth in rents and higher growth in the number of sales ads. And what we want to investigate is kind of what is the effect of this policy uncertainty, or is this mainly driven by policy uncertainty, that these housing market trends in Berlin differ relative to the control group, but also within Berlin we see these different patterns when it comes to the who supplies these ads, the housing industry, versus kind of real estate agents or private people. So next steps, that will be crucial. We want to also examine the effects on construction activity. So if policy uncertainty plays a role, we might expect that this will have negative or adverse effects on construction activity. That's on our list. We also want to study more closely to what extent these effects, comparing Berlin to the control group, to what extent these effects are driven by differential population growth rates. We want to expand the sample periods, use other data. At IFO we have another data source which might be helpful in this regard, F&B data, which collects kind of rental and sales ads from different suppliers. And as I said, we also want to extend the sample period. That's it, and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and suggestions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have one question related to another segment. So you mentioned the private housing companies, and there are also communal or municipal housing companies. We have one representative, by the way, of such companies in Lisbon. And in Berlin, they also make up a large part of the housing stock. So it would be interesting to see their behavior at the face of rent control. And also, while in 21, rent freeze was cancelled for private companies, it was not cancelled for the public companies, for the municipal companies. But there are, in the last couple of months, there are more and more announcements of these communal companies that they will raise their rents.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a very good point. So far, we have not been able to identify those, and we are not entirely sure whether, let's say, these public housing is really covered on, for example, Immobilien Scout 24. If I think, let's say, I know, for example, that, let's say, the state government supplies some apartments for nurses, teachers, police officers, and so on. And I think these are not covered in Immobilien Scout, and I think that's why we haven't been able so far to look at that. But we definitely need to explore other sources to look at public housing. That's your point, right? I mean, be it municipalities or the state of Berlin. Yeah, that's on our list. Thank you.
Yeah, mostly municipalities, because the state-owned housing is very tiny, but the municipal companies, they have housing companies, they have quite large. numbers of housing
May
stock.
I ask a question, because you know the Berlin context much better than I as a Berlin citizen. So, I mean, given that Berlin, the city is also a state, are there municipal companies in Berlin offering such apartments, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I meant state companies like I don't know, something like belonging to the state, to the nation, say, so to speak, to the federal state.
Or something like Betriebswohnung also. These things.
No. I was talking mainly about municipal housing, because it makes up a large part of housing.
Okay.
Thanks. I was also wondering, because now you try to, I mean, that's what we economists always do. We try to read from the data to infer on intentions, right? Did you also just call them and ask, right? Particularly these big companies that are owning something, because I mean, it is nice to observe the behavior, right? But I mean, there should also be some explanations given by them. I don't know, official communications or internal, I don't know what. Maybe they also really care about their reputation, right? There's probably a lot of reputational risk here. I don't know how they themselves perceive that, because they may perceive it differently than the general public and differently than we economists. So I'm wondering whether, for answering that, non-economic social sciences approaches would actually be appropriate to understand the intentions. Because it's difficult to read from the data. Because the last question always remains, why are they not catching up in terms of prices? Because they could.
Absolutely. So my view on this is, so far, I mean, our data suggests, but maybe we need to think more about it, that policy uncertainty seems to play a role. Otherwise, I wouldn't understand why, if rents are increasing much more than in the control group, while sales prices do not. And then also disentangling these trends in Berlin by kind of who's offering these ads. All this suggests that policy uncertainty, in particular for the large private sector companies, plays a role, and I fully agree. It makes a lot of sense to look at official communication, which we haven't done so far. Maybe to do some interviews to better understand kind of what's going on in Berlin.
And could you actually get rid of the large ones in your data, so that you only look at the private, small ones versus the large ones, because they may be different, because there is a reputation risk?
You mean within the group of private sector companies?
Yes, exactly.
That's
because the smaller ones may be different than the large ones, because the smaller ones don't have reputational risk.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I don't know whether we can do that. I think there is one variable classifying the type, I mean, who's offering it, and I'm not sure, I'm not totally sure how this is kind of coded, this variable. We need to check. I fear we are not able to do that because I think it's classified like private sector company and not kind of giving the name or so.
Okay.
So I think we are not able to do that, but that's definitely we need to explore. Yeah.
So there are no further questions now. We can ask them to break.
So thanks again for your attention and comments and questions.
So we're having another coffee break now because the connection is still not working properly. So we'll try and fix this.